We're with Evan Wiig, the director of the Farmers Guild. If you read Jonah Raskin's column in The Bohemian, you know that he's part of the sexy farmer movement. How did you feel about that characterization by our colleague and friend Raskin?
Well, that was quite a number of years ago.
Yeah. But you're still sexy.
Sure. I don't think it was.
You're still a farmer. Yeah.
I don't think it was referring to me in particular. I think the article that came out was our very first publicity that the Farmers Guild ever got. Referred to young, sexy farmers simply to get people's attention.
Right.
And the fact that we have farmers in a place in Sonoma County where the average farmer is 60 years old.
Right.
Really, if you get farmers in their 20s.
Just by dint of youth, they can be sexy. Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah. Let's talk about what the Farmers Guild is first, to those who aren't familiar. What is the Farmers Guild?
So the Farmers Guild, they're local coalitions of farmers and ranchers that get together on a regular basis to talk shop, trade resources, share notes. Mm-hmm. It's what I see as a social and professional hub for sort of a new agricultural community that really represents small farms, new farmers, and those focused on regenerative agricultural practices.
Sustainable stuff, okay.
Mm-hmm.
How does that differ from the old farms, at least in this region?
Well, I don't know if it necessarily
old organizations, I should say. Yeah.
Sure. Well, we try really hard to make sure that people understand that one of the most important things for new farmers to succeed are relationships with older farmers.
Right.
We're about to, in the next 10, 15 years, there's a parcel of agricultural land in America the size of the Louisiana Purchase. Mm-hmm. It's going to trade hands. All those farmers are going to be retiring, moving on, because
I get it. Not literally, but
not literally.
It's going to
combined.
Turn over. Okay,
that's a huge.
That's happening. They're selling it.
Louisiana Purchase. They're selling it back. They had enough.
Okay, now I got it.
It's a lot of land, so we have to ask a serious question as a broader community. How are we going to make that land transfer? Mm-hmm. How is that going to get brought back into the next generation? Are they going to have the skills? Are they going to have the resources? Are they going to have simply the access to that land? Are they going to be part of the communities in which they farm, or are they going to be owned by a prospecting hedge fund in Shanghai,
right.
That's then leased out to farmers organizations, right, and whatnot? I mean, it's a really big question that really determines the future of our food. And so the viability of new and young farmers and their ability to take the lessons and the knowledge of those older farmers and apply it in a way that's viable is going to determine how we feed ourselves.
It's interesting how we have a sort of national obsession, or at least regional obsession, with sustainable farming, but we don't think about sustainable farmers, and it is necessarily a generational issue because old farmers die, mm-hmm, and new farmers have to be trained in the know-how and knowledge of how to be effective farmers, and so that's sort of what, in part, is one of your missions sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely.
Keeping that sort of sourcing that workforce in the know-how.
Right. And I was actually hanging out with the ag commissioners out in Solano County yesterday, and he was looking around in this what used to be a more rural county and seeing the suburbanization and constant sprawl, and he kind of recognized that a lot of the old-time farmers look at these young kids coming in from the city, thinking agriculture is hip, but he looks around and sees that the rural communities aren't providing enough replacements. So really, we need to start looking to the cities to try to figure out how do we get urban young people into agriculture in a way that they can really make it happen.
Okay, so that brings me to something. So there's this joker in Petaluma that coined this phrase, which he prints on T-shirts, and it's hickster, right? So there's a Petaluma sort of predilection toward perceiving itself as sort of a hick town, or at one point, right? But then there's this hipster influx coming from San Francisco and Oakland, and so they combine into this portmanteau, hickster. And I think that's done with a sense of self-irony, and it's supposed to be funny. And hicksters are, I guess, real, right? But it seems like there's a bit of a resentment to the urban folk coming in
Sure.
and participating in our regional agriculture. How do you head that off, or do you?
Oh, absolutely. It's a delicate conversation and one that's absolutely necessary to have.
I mean, it is hip to be a farmer now,
It's hip.
but it can't just be a trend. This has
No.
to be something they invest themselves in.
Absolutely.
Do you face those issues with people who are just tourists?
Constantly.
Hmm.
Yeah, you got a lot of people who are interested in getting into agriculture
Because it's cool.
because it's cool.
Right.
Sure. You've got homesteaders, you've got small farmers, you've got people who just buy up rural land. But the tough thing about that conversation is that on the one hand, there's the detrimental elements of that kind of influx. People buying rural properties that aren't going to be farming it
Right.
in the long term, so that farmers are now competing with urbanites who are buying these rural properties with the intention of being closer to the land or being
Right.
farmers, hicksters, whatever you want to
And the
call it.
land is like one of the primary resources, obviously.
Right.
Without the land, you can't do a thing.
It's
So-
the number one challenge
Right.
to new farmers is accessing land. But at the same time, the influx of an interest of folks who are actually interested in agriculture, not simply people who are looking for large parcels of land on which to live, but actually to be involved in their agricultural community, to actually know where their food comes from. The fact that that's popular, the fact that people in downtown San Francisco are concerned about the way that the farms are operating, I don't see that as a bad thing at all. We have some really old school farmers out here in Sonoma County who wouldn't exist today if it wasn't for an interest in agriculture, the ability that dairy farmers here in Sonoma County, for instance, have had in being able to convert to organic. I mean,
Right.
the shift to organic dairy production in Sonoma County has actually saved a number of old school family farms. Without that switch, they wouldn't have been economically viable, but that switch was only made possible
by this renewed interest.
Exactly.
I think it's fascinating, and I'm totally with you. And then you get these spurs, though, which are interesting to me, and I'm also totally with them, like Strauss's barista milk, you know, which is a product born necessarily out of both, I think, the regionalization of local farms and popularity of that, organic certainly, and the fact that I need a kick-ass coffee, right?
Sure.
So, I mean, that kind of productization. Do you feel this is a part of a sustaining transformation? Are we going to have barista milk 2 years from now?
Oh, I see this whole thing continuing. Absolutely, this is just the beginning.
Okay.
The fact is, right now we have people asking what is sustainable. It's becoming a buzzword,
Yeah.
and
yeah.
it is losing some of its clout.
And that's what worries me. And so I want to come back to that when we come back to the next segment. We're with Evan Wiig, the director of the Farmers Guild. And we're back with Evan Wiig, the director of the Farmers Guild locally. We're having kind of an interesting chat about sustainability and trendiness versus transformational changes when it comes to sustainable farming practices and farming in general, and the hipster phenomena, which is not a phenomena, it's just a t-shirt. But I worry about this. I worry that if it's cool, it has the chance of not being cool eventually, because that's what happens to coolness. That's what happened to me. You're on the fringe of not being cool anymore. How do you, no, I'm just kidding. You're 30 something, right? You're somewhere in there?
29.
I might see, you get 6 months left. How are you going to vouchsafe what you do from the hip factor,
Sure.
so that it isn't just hip and goes away, that it's actually a thing?
Well, I mean, we had an event this past weekend where we brought over 300 people out to Schoen Farm, which is the Santa Rosa Junior College educational farm.
Right.
And a lot of those folks were actively farming. A lot of those were the real deal agriculture. And there was also a lot of young, hip folks from both the city as well as urban areas of Sonoma County who came out. And yeah, it was cool. And we had a party and we had the Easy Leaves playing and we had all sorts of stuff. It was definitely, I think it was pretty hip.
I dig that, but was there like a thing on the door saying, if your beard isn't this long, you can't come in? I mean, there wasn't there?
There was, yes.
Yeah, I do it.
But everyone who went to that walked away with a deeper understanding of agriculture. So so long as there's substance within the popularity, so long as, I mean, agriculture and food systems, if you want to get the new generation involved, you have to make it interesting. You have to make it fun. There's no reason why we shouldn't include community and a youthful element to agriculture. In fact, those things are absolutely essential if we want to continue this.
So you're saying that the appeal is sort of the gateway, and once
Yes.
they're in, there actually is there are programs of substance that actually that bring them in at a deeper level, so that it becomes
Right.
more of a permanent lifestyle choice.
And there has to be substance behind that entrance.
Right.
And I totally acknowledge and recognize that there are elements of this that where in some cases there are that those hip entrances to one thing or another, and behind which there is no substance.
Yeah, and it's not just your responsibility to save this generation from themselves. You're doing a great job. I'm just saying, I'm not putting this at your feet. I'm just, but you do have the opportunity, I think, to, and it's awesome that you recognize that potentiality to head it off and shape it into something.
Right.
Yeah.
And, and you talk about the millennial generation. We are more concerned about where our food comes from than any other generation before us. We're asking
Gen X
questions.
just eats out of garbage cans still.
Exactly.
You've seen these guys?
Exactly. Well, I mean, and without questioning where our food comes from, nothing will change. If you don't question where your shoes are made and who makes them, how much they get per day for doing so, Nike has no reason to change.
Right.
And right now we're in a huge challenge with climate change, with urbanization, with the monopolization of our food system, that if we don't get young people in urban places really asking questions and exploring where their food comes from, I don't think that simply leaving it alone and saying, you urban kids, you stick with urban problems, and we out in the country are going to deal with rural problems. One is entirely dependent upon the other and vice versa. So
it is actually one community ultimately.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I wonder, you obviously have a passion for this and a professional proclivity for it. What ignited this spark in you? Where were you, and how old were you when this started? And why didn't anyone stop you?
That's a good question. So I actually don't come from a farming background. I was born in Denver, Colorado, in the city, having no connection really. My great aunt had a farm out in Nebraska. We used to go visit during the summers, and the glimmer of memory that I have of that experience was each time we visited, there was less of the farm left, surrounded by cornfields. And I think by the time I last visited, she had a small chicken coop, and that was pretty much the extent of that farm. So that was my only memory as a child. And then I went off to college in San Francisco.
Where'd you go?
University of San Francisco.
Right on, yeah.
Studied the humanities.
Nice.
No connection to agriculture
or any job potential.
Or any job potential. Somehow I landed a semi job working in the publishing industry in New York City.
Nice.
So I lived for 5 years in the middle of New York City. Lived in Harlem and then eventually moved to Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn.
I mean, you're like an urbanite at this point. Like you're
about as urban as you can get.
Yeah. I mean, that defines urbanity.
Right.
No, it doesn't. That's urbanness. But
yeah. So I moved into a neighborhood, Bed-Stuy, where it was such an urban existence that I didn't have a backyard. I didn't have a front yard. I didn't even have access to my rooftop or my stoop. I had nowhere to get outside and just be. So there was an old abandoned plot of earth on my block where 2 buildings had burnt down.
You mean like a lot? Like
a lot. It was just a lot where there was just weeds and old broken Hennessy bottles.
Nice.
And so me and the old timers got together one day. This is how I actually met my neighborhood.
Yeah.
And we decided we needed to do something with it. So we got together and decided to make it into a community garden.
And not a Hennessy
and not a
distillery, okay.
Yeah, dispensary.
I thought you were going the other way, dude.
Yeah, no. We got in there, we cleaned up the bottles, we pulled out the weeds.
And you transformed the otherwise dead piece of land into something that could thrive.
Yeah. And
but it sounds like you also created a sense of community. That's how you
absolutely.
Wow.
I mean, this was a predominantly African American neighborhood. I was a young white transplant. There's not a lot of opportunities to simply, you don't just make friends on the street, just hanging out on your stoop necessarily.
Right.
But this gave us something to do, something to be a part of together, improving our one little block there in Brooklyn. And over the course of 4 years, transforming this abandoned lot into a garden, bringing in soil, planting trees. Over the course of this, I learned how to farm.
Yeah, but you didn't do this with like city permission. I think you just took the land.
We did eventually get city permission.
And they gave it to you.
They not only gave it to us, they were actually really supportive of the community garden program. They actually helped us get soil to put in there and some tools and They had some really great programs through the program called the Green Guerrillas.
And this is your first exposure to actually working the dirt?
Yes.
And wow.
Yep.
You're like an old guy at that point.
I was an old boy. I mean, I think I was, 20, 21 years old or something like that.
You were older then than you are now.
This is true.
But that whetted your appetite for this kind of work, it sounds like.
Yeah, and that was not farming. That was gardening.
Yeah.
Very different. But it did get my hands in the soil. It just started bringing up a lot of questions about why did it take so long to grow this carrot, and why is the carrot at the farmer's market cost so much more at the one at the grocery store. And I think one of the biggest realizations I had was one day we brought in all the neighborhood kids to show them, and I'm standing there next to our fields, and I think there was some basil, and I was explaining to them how the garden works, how the soil works, and how the plants grow, and suddenly one of the kids raises their hands and says, points to the basil and says, "So you eat that?" And I'm like, "Well, yeah, you eat that. It's basil. You put it on your pizza." And they're like, "But it's coming out of the ground."
Wow.
And
okay.
so I picked a leaf and I just put it in my mouth, and all the kids go, "Ew!" And at that moment, I realized how disconnected I and an entire generation after me has become from where their food comes from.
Wow. Let's come back to that in a second. We're with Evan Wiig, the director of the Farmers Guild, and we'll pick up on that when we come back. And we're back with Evan Wiig, the director of the Farmers Guild. We left on a bit of a cliffhanger. You're talking about kids in your neighborhood where you had helped organize and build a community garden with your community. You interfaced with some children who didn't understand that vegetation, vegetables in this case, grew from the ground, which is so dispiriting and haunting. How did you overcome that moment besides demonstrating, as you told us in the last segment?
Well, I think what happened the moment following, which was at one moment they're disgusted that I would put something in my mouth that grew out of the dirt.
Right.
Literally minutes after that took place, the kids are running around the garden, picking things, saying, "Can I eat this?" And I'm like, "Yeah, sure, go for it." And they pick another thing. I'm like, "Yeah, go for it." Pick another thing. I'm like, "Don't eat that. That might be poisonous. It's poisonous." But they were so excited about it. So just the concept of that you could grow your own food.
Wow.
Was so exciting to them. So recognizing how easy that shift is was a turning point for me. Recognizing that it's just the culture that we've built in. We're incredibly an urbanized culture
And dependent on systems.
Right.
Right. And so I'm curious about, so you're doing really good work there, obviously. What brought you all the way across the United States to our bucolic oasis out here, right? Was it a calling? Was it a way to deepen your passion, or could you do more here than you could there?
I didn't know that at the time, but I think the garden had me asking questions, and those questions led me to looking into the food system in a larger sense, looking into what agriculture is, how our food system works, the relationship between farmers and the markets. And I don't mean the farmer's market, I mean the market, this abstract sense that we've created between food production and food consumption, and how in that one element, in that one moment we had back in the garden, I saw a perfect example of that disconnect.
And how the market actually creates an abstraction.
Exactly.
Right.
But how does that exist on a macro level, between the disconnect between production and demand? And at that point I realized how little I knew about that whole system, and both wanting to be in the garden more than I wanted to be in the office, coupled with just a deep curiosity as to what it's really like to be on the production side.
Right. You moved your desk outside.
I moved my desk outside.
I knew it.
I had a friend.
Yeah.
Back that I knew back in San Francisco, where I met in totally different, unrelated. I think we were still protesting the war in Iraq at that time.
Right. So we're going back to 2002 at that point.
Yeah, that's when I met him originally, and then when I moved out to New York City, he moved up to Valley Forge.
Oh, okay.
Where his family had some property, and they were raising cattle. And I don't think he intended to get into cattle production at the time, but helping out with his family's property.
Is this beef or dairy, or what was he?
This was beef.
Okay.
It was a cow-calf operation. And he, during the time I was in New York City, he gradually started taking on more responsibility until finally he was managing this 1,300-acre property out in Valley Forge. just on the other side of the border with Marin.
Yeah, sort of on route to Bodega Bay. Yeah, wow. So it sounds like he presented an opportunity to you to come out, or?
Yeah, so he was transitioning to organic production.
Great.
He was wanting to diversify and go direct to market, as opposed to a cow-calf operation, is which you just raise the animals and then sell them out at auction at whatever price the market will give you, as opposed to creating your own food business.
Right, and also having control of your product.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the more you have control of your own product and the market itself, the more your practices matter.
Right.
Because if you're selling a product that's going to get ground up and sold anonymously to, who knows, one cow may end up in
all over the United
1,000
States.
different hamburgers all over the United States. Right,
Yeah.
exactly. What real incentive besides your own integrity do you have to raise your animals in a certain way and provide for the land? Obviously there's other incentives, but really when you go direct to market, you have that extra incentive.
It's like instant accountability.
Right.
I mean, you are looking your customer in the eye.
Absolutely.
Is the customer also accountable to the farmer, though? Is that relationship reciprocal?
Oh, absolutely. And that's what we started doing. So I left New York City, quit my job, moved out, and actually sent my friend a resume for a position of ranch hand at the time.
But the humanities degree. I love it.
With the humanities degree.
Now
Obviously,
we know what you can do with it. Right?
Yeah,
That's
I was
awesome.
definitely not the most qualified candidate, but at the
I was
time,
going to say that you're actually less qualified because of
this is possible. But at the same time, because they were going direct to market,
Yeah.
it's not just about building fences. They also needed a website.
Yeah.
They also needed to do sales. They also needed to do marketing, which at the time they didn't have any of that in place. So in addition to getting up in the morning and feeding the pigs and the chickens and helping to build fences, I was designing a website for them.
That's great.
Showing up to the farmer's market. And so that's how I got to that place and ended up in Valley Forge, population 126. And that's when I started realizing the real relationship between consumer and producer. What we were doing was going direct to market, where I actually did get to have a conversation with my customer.
Well, speaking of customers, on the customer side, what can we do? What are we supposed to do to contribute to the kind of work that everyone? It sounds like there's a movement afoot, especially locally, and of course you're one of the drivers of it. But what can we do to support that, and what is our responsibility?
Well, I think the biggest responsibility is simply asking questions.
Okay.
That's what I can ask most of anyone, is just simply asking how your food is raised, what is the system in which it operates. Is there a difference in when you buy a pound of ground beef at the supermarket as opposed to a pound of ground beef direct from the farmer?
Mm-hmm.
How and why would that be different? And you suddenly start asking these questions and realize that, as an example, when you look at the distribution of the food dollars, every dollar we spend on food, 11 cents goes to the farmer.
That's it.
11 cents. And why? Why is that? And what are the consequences of that arrangement? We have 31 cents goes to the service industry alone.
Wow.
That's not transportation, that's not insurance, that's not packaging, any of that kind of stuff. It's simply the service industry.
Okay.
The other big chunk is retail. So just the shelf space, the advertising, the lobbyists, all of that costs money. And so when finally it trickles down to the farmer, they're dealing with a very small percentage, which is why people go to the farmer's market, which is why farmers will opt for getting into their truck, driving into town. In some cases, they drive hours and stand there all day selling their products. It's not just because they like the farmer's market and want to chat with you. It's because they're going to go home with a hell of a lot more than 11 cents on the dollar.
And I think we forget that itself is an aspect of sustainability, is making this a viable lifestyle and economic choice for the farmer to continue doing what they do.
Right, and it provides some agency to the farmer. So when you're having this conversation directly with the farmer, you can start asking questions. You can engage in a conversation about where that food comes from, as opposed to, for instance, when you buy chicken from one of these large, southern conglomerates, or now international conglomerates.
Right.
The farmers don't have a lot of say in how those chickens are raised. They don't have a lot of say as to the byproducts and the waste. They don't have a lot of say as to what their contract is. Essentially, we have, over the course of the last 50 years, just this massive conglomeration of our food industry. In the case of beef, for instance, 4 companies now own more than 90% of all beef production in America.
Wow.
And the numbers are the same for, similar in the sense of pigs and chickens and corn, soybeans, all of these things. In the case of pigs, our largest pork producer just got sold to a Chinese company, conglomerate. So we now have more than 50% of pork production administered by a Chinese corporation,
right.
where if you're the actual farmer growing the pigs, you're entering into a contract with someone who's so large, so powerful, that owns every single element in this vertically integrated supply chain, that you really think you're going to sit down and negotiate?
Right.
You really think you can get to the table with the owner of Smithfield and say, look, I was looking over our contract the other day, and I'm just thinking, like, I want to provide the pigs a little more space, or I want to try this breed instead. I think it would be better on pasture. No, you don't have those conversations. You do as you're told in the contract, or Smithfield goes somewhere else.
Right. So we can empower our farmers. By empowering our farmers, we empower ourselves as
Absolutely.
consumers. And that's a nice, virtuous circle.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Empowered farmers are the key to an empowered and sustainable food system.
Evan Wiig, you have to come back so we can continue having this conversation. Evan Wiig, he's the director of the Farmers Guild. Where can we find you guys online?
You can find us on farmersguild.org. We're also pretty active on Facebook.
Excellent, sir. Thank you again. Hope you come back.
Absolutely.
Cheers.